Good Sunday morning, everybody. Father Leo here, and this second Sunday of Lent. And we are making our journey in our love journey towards Easter. And of course, the purpose of Lent is to help us to grow in our love for God, our love for one another, our love for ourselves, and above all, love for the planet. But within that, I have to talk of little specifics. And the war in Ukraine has given me, along with today's gospel reading, which makes brings Satan forward. Now, I think a lot of enlightened Christians have kind of got away from belief in Satan, demonology, and the work of darkness. For example, the Bible refers to principalities and powers. Paul refers to, in his writings, to war, spiritual warfare. And there's a lot of writings about darkness in the Bible. There is a lot of it. And I think it's at our own risk if we ignore that. I think it's our risk. Closing our eyes to a reality which is very much a part of the human journey of evolution. Now, what really has sparked my talk today is the gospel. Because you notice at the very last line, it brings forward the word Satan. Satan. And like I say, a lot of so-called enlightened Christians have said, oh, there's no devil. Do you remember back in the 80s? People would jokingly say after they took a third cigarette, the devil made me do it. And we'd all kind of chuckle, yeah, sure. And we'd all kind of chuckle. We're laughing. There's no devil, right? That was old-time religion. Sure, we don't believe that kind of stuff any longer. We're too enlightened. Well, maybe we're enlightened, or maybe we are mistaken. I don't know. But let's talk about it for a minute. When we think about the war in the Ukraine, and I want to tell you, did you ever ask yourself the question, who invented war? When did they invent it? And how long has it been with us? What can we do about it? Well, at this particular time, if you go to many spiritual people, and today's gospel is certainly one of them, we read that Jesus went 40 days in the desert and he was tempted by Satan. Well, if you believe the Bible, what are you going to do with that one? Paul talked about spiritual warfare. For centuries, the church in Eucharistic prayer had reference to principalities and powers. Okay? So the whole idea of demonology and Satan, it was very much prominent in the life of the church. And of course, the way the church dealt with it was by having exorcists who were trained to do exorcisms. And I know there was a film came out a while ago, years and years ago. I just forget the name of it, but it had that whole idea of doing the exorcist and the terrible scenes of doing it to the young girl who was supposedly possessed by the devil. Okay, you know more about that than I do. But having said that, I also want to say that, like I say, it's in the scriptures. If you read the scriptures and you see what has happened, I think that in many ways we become so enlightened, including myself. And actually, I was the diocesan exorcist for 5 years. And I received a ritual from the bishop, and I did perform some exorcists, and I did see some unusual things happen. Now, I don't want to talk about it today. Well, I won't talk about it anytime. It's confidential. But I know the experience of being an exorcist. I gave it up because I moved into psychology. Rightly or wrong. You decide. But all I'm saying is that it's been very much a part of Christian thinking for centuries. Even though at the present day, I think in many ways, we have discounted it. Discounted it. There's only God and God loving. Well, the Bible contradicts that. The Bible says there is Satan, there are demons, there is a spiritual world, and there is spiritual warfare. So, now why I'm bringing that up is because I want to talk about what's happening in the Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. And that's really important because now, when I got the Toronto paper today, and I'm shifting gears here, when I got the Toronto paper, it's stories about a happening, an event right now. So I think, as I see it, I call it a story. And that story has many parts to it. Every journalist that wrote in the Toronto paper had a little different perspective on what's happening and how the West is dealing with it, how they're trying to be a positive influence, and that kind of thing. I was really proud about leading how our Prime Minister went to various countries around the world talking about the dangers to democracy today. And I read that and I thought, hey man, you're really doing a great job here. Continue. Democracy. Because the same thing has happened politically as happened in our church. You may notice when there is elections, the percentage of people who vote is going down. People seem to be discouraged, given up on politics or whatever, and they don't vote. And the same thing has happened in our church, where people remain silent. And the powers that be, with power and control, dominated people. When Jesus said, I came to set you free, don't you see the dichotomy there? See the dichotomy? The shadow side of the church. So today then, I want to first remind you, a couple months ago we talked about the shadow. The shadow is the dark side of myself and you. And Carl Jung, whom I studied, the Jungian psychology brings out the whole idea of shadow. Light and shadow, light and shadow. That we live that ambiguity. And that's kind of our struggle, isn't it? We suddenly aware that I'm greedy. Now I got to deal with it. I realize I'm an angry person. I have to deal with it. And so my shadow shows itself in my actions. And I have to deal with that shadow in order to enable me to live more in the light. And that's part of our growth in our humanity. The glory of God is a person fully alive. And as Plato said a couple thousand years ago, the unexamined life is a life not worth living. So I have to examine my life. Well, I'm not the only one that has to examine if I'm going to come fully alive. Everybody does. The shadow. I talked about the shadow. I have a shadow. The city in which I live has a shadow, which is easily seen. The province in which I live has a shadow. The country in which I live has a shadow. All the countries of the world have a shadow. The dark side of humanity. And so when you think of all the countries and the shadow come together, it's the dark side of humanity. So in the midst even of this thing in Korea, oh God, my memory's fading. You know where the war is. The tremendous courage and strength of so many people. So many people here in Canada reaching out. People in the Ukraine. So we see the light and the darkness. To combat that shadow. Now, it's the story. The shadow is there, as Carl Jung would teach, and I teach. I see part of the answer to this, but the problem is, it's like you take suppose you're eating a dinner, and you got your family and friends over, they're all around the table, they have a great meal, and then the hostess puts a big pumpkin pie right down in front of you. And pumpkin pie is your favorite. And you decide when she isn't looking, you're going to take a little slice of it. So you take a little slice of it, little tiny, tiny slice. It's very small, very, very small. And when the hostess isn't looking, you chuck it down. But because you were tense and you'd taken the pie when you really shouldn't have, but she sees you, she says, how do you like it? Oh, he says, I really don't know what to say because I only had a small piece. I'd have to eat more of the pie to really get a sense of how I would like it. So that's what a story is. It's that little wee piece of the pie. A narrative is the whole pie. It's the story, a long story. It's a history story, okay? And that's important if I'm going to talk to you about narrative. We have to understand it's a long story. Shadow is a long story. The narrative about war and shadow is a long story. Let's get to it. 10,000 BC. Up until then, men were hunters and gatherers, and women were busy in their local communities. And the women in particular were the ones who were dealing with the spirituality, and Sophia was the goddess. Okay? And things are going well along that line until some men discovered if you cultivate the earth and plant seeds, suddenly it gives up and they get a harvest. And they said, well, why don't we do that instead of going hunting and gathering? Why don't we stay home, cultivate a plot of land, we'll have a harvest, and we can eat. So the men decided. Now when they did, of course, they took over. They changed from the goddess to a god. And it was a male god they put up in the sky. Authoritarian God. God who would judge the living and the dead. A distant God. And that became our God for centuries. But more than that, you see, let's use my imagination here. We know it didn't happen. Well, it happened this way. Here you have Bill. He's got a plot of land. He's raising his harvest. But it's poor land, stony. And he sees Pat down the line here. He's got a lovely piece of land, and his harvest is 3 times as much. And so he says, I want what he has. So he goes down and said, look, I'll trade you my stony one for your good one. And he said, well, no way. So he goes home. He's got 3 big sons. He said, no, I went down there and I offered him to trade, but he wouldn't. Now let's the 4 of us get a club. He's only got 1 son, and the 4 of us will go down there, and we will help him to give up his land for us, for ours. Or he can just go somewhere else. So they all get together, the 4 of them, they go down there, and they beat him up and his sons, and they get the good land. Now that imaginative story is not imaginative in fact. That's what happened. And overall, that they wondered afterwards, what are we going to call what we just did? A whole bunch of them did that, eh? And they were stuck for a word. What will we call it? Somebody said, I know, let's call it war. Yeah, and they all said, good word as any, let's go with war. And that's where war was invented at the time of the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago. Okay? Now, since then, of course, we have seen how that is played out in the narrative of the human race. We see it in the Bible. Cain and Abel, Saul and David. We saw the war that was there when the people of God found the promised land. They had to overcome the natives that were already there and chase them off the land. And so war, the idea of might is right. We want what you have, and if you won't give it to us, we'll come and take it. And it'll cost you. We'll kill you. So war worked its way through history. That's the narrative. That's the narrative of our human shadow. That is, the war is part of our narrative as a shadow. Evolutionary. We get down to our own time. As a kid, I don't really remember World War I. I was too young for that. But I sure remember World War II. Now, I had two brothers of age, and they were not very anxious to go to war. But being farmers and needing harvesting, they were exempt. And I used to tease them, say, hey, you two guys are just afraid to go to war. Needless to say, they didn't take it very well. Anyway, it doesn't matter now. They're dead. Doesn't matter. All right. That was me being a kid, not a kid. But the Second World War, yes. I remember the Korean War. One of my classmates had joined the army, and he died in the Korean War, in Korea. Then, we see after that, well, there were a lot of wars. Korean War. And then there was the Vietnam War. And we know how deeply involved our friends to the South were in the Vietnam War. Now, they should have been minding their own business, but no, they got drawn in. There was something they were going to get from it. Vietnam War, what would be next? God, there were so many of them. Remember when there was weapons of mass destruction? Quick, go in there. Do some killing. Change the government. And that has been a big part of the West for several centuries. South America. How the CIA repeatedly changed governments in South America countries. Revolution. And how many people were killed and died. War. And other wars. I remember a few years ago, a reporter wrote that at the present moment, there were 40 wars going on planet Earth. How many there are today, I don't know. Well, that's a lot of wars. So what I'm saying to you, war had a beginning at the agricultural revolution, 10,000 years BC. And it, just like everything else in humanity which has evolved, it has evolved down through the centuries, constantly. And that is the shadow side of humanity. So when you ask, if we would ask the question, where does war start from? The first opinion would be, some people might say Satan, as today's gospel does. Or they might say, it's man's shadow. It may not be either other, maybe it's both. I don't know. In our discussion after the meditation, you can tell us which you think is right. Or what your opinion is, anyway. So I don't know, of course. So there is your war. Now the biggest thing is, of course, whether it's Satan or whether it is war is the narrative and the psychological, whichever it is, the big question is how to overcome it. It is humanity's shadow. Humanity, by its birthright, are lovers and charitable and kind people. But we have the shadow. Now you can call that shadow Satan, demons, evil spirits, whatever. Or you can call it shadow. Either one. Now, John Sanford, who was a great Jungian psychologist, wrote that the way we overcome shadow is by befriending it. Not doing violence to it, befriending it. How do I befriend my shadow? That's number one. How do we get humanity to know it's about a shadow? To know that's where war's coming from. The shadow side of humanity. And move from, and have humanity deal with their shadow. Or if they want to have, if they blame Satan, how do they have exorcists? So again, you may choose today whatever you think, but I'm glad to hear from you, whichever you think it is, or whether you think it's both. I'm not smart enough to know which it is, or maybe something else. I don't know, but that's simply the way I see it. I could be kind of close to the mark, or I could be dead wrong. I know you're a lot smarter than me, so if you've got a better answer, let's hear it. And but that's where it is. Shadow side of humanity. War was invented 10,000 BC, and it's this violent side of humanity erupting, manifesting in war. Because you know as well as I do, after Ukraine, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, there will be another one. And after that, there will be another one and another one, unless we deal with the cause of it and deal with it in a redemptive, loving kind of way. Now in our meditation, you can think about it, pray about it, and then you can share your thoughts with one another and all of us. God bless.